Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we're talking about how we might have a better idea of what this secret new Nintendo Switch 2 revision is going to be. So, a while back, it was discovered that there's this new product code for something having to do with the Switch 2, OSM. We're not sure if it's like a Switch 2 Pro, Switch 2 Lite, or something else. But when this news initially broke, there was a lot of conversation on how this would be too soon for us to get a new revision of the Switch 2. But we just got a report today, or by the time this video comes out, we just got a report yesterday from Nikkei that Nintendo is indeed planning a revision to the Nintendo Switch 2. But this revision isn't a Switch 2 Pro, and it is not a Switch 2 Lite. However, with this in mind, and a few other things that have been unexpected, I do think it paints a very different picture on how Nintendo may be handling revisions for the Switch 2. And some of this is actually some pretty good news that I think will excite a lot of people. So that's what we're diving into today. Now before going forward, let me point out I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos, I would very much appreciate your support, subscribing if you haven't done so already. But here's a report from Nikkei. Due to laws in place by the European Union, Nintendo is now going to have to align their right to repair policy to allow the Switch 2 and the Joy-Cons to have replaceable batteries. Now technically you can go into the Switch 2 or the Joy-Cons and take it apart, but it isn't something easy to do. It's something that you would have to look up, it was something you need some special tools for, and so at least in the European market, Nintendo's going to be releasing changes to the Switch 2 and the Joy-Cons that will allow you to replace the batteries. And it's being reported that Nintendo may also be implementing this in Japan and the United States, depending on if the consumer awareness of the right to repair increases. So the more conversation that is had about this will strengthen the chances that Nintendo is going to release revisions in other markets where you'll be able to replace the batteries more easily. In other words, Nintendo is going to have to release a revision of the Switch 2 and the Joy-Cons that allows this. This report becomes more interesting to me when I also consider this unused model code we found on Nintendo's account portal, OSM. When you request for this OSM model code, an image of a Switch 2 comes up, and so this has led many to believe that it might be some kind of Nintendo Switch 2, like a revision. Looking at the image, personally, it kind of looks like the Joy-Cons are fused. It looks almost like it would be a Switch 2 Lite. Of course, that's just a simplified image. It's hard to really gauge from just that. But when we initially heard about this back in January, there were different theories going around. A lot of people are freaking out about the idea of maybe Nintendo already planning a Switch 2 Pro. We never actually got a Switch 1 Pro, we got the Switch OLED, and I don't doubt that there were plans for a Switch Pro, but it never actually made it out to market. And maybe Nintendo might see that it's worthwhile this time around to have a Switch 2 Pro, but I do have to say that we're just getting started with the Switch 2, and we're seeing some really impressive ports from third parties like Resident Evil Requiem, Cyberpunk, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, and it just seems like things are getting better and better, especially as more updates come out for DLSS and developers figure out how to use the hardware more and more. I don't even think we've really seen much from Nintendo of them taking advantage of the hardware yet. So this whole idea of a Switch 2 Pro being already in the works, I mean, it's something that I really just don't care about right now. It may happen, but I wouldn't expect it for at least another 3 years, if not more. And even then, like the Switch 1 generation, they may deem it to not even be necessary, and I would argue that right now the Switch 2 is more on par with technology now compared to the Switch 1 when it came out, at least when accounting for diminishing returns. So I don't think a Switch 2 Pro is the most likely thing that's to come next. Now this whole battery replacement thing might be more like kind of a quiet revision, but I do believe that there's probably something else in the works, and that something else is a Switch 2 Lite. Now, is a Switch 2 Lite the model code OSM? Hard to say with certainty right now. This OSM actually might be what we've heard about from Nikkei, this revised Switch 2 where you can replace the battery. But before this report, I was seriously considering that a Switch 2 Lite might even come out as soon as this year, like sometime in the second half, which some people might think is too soon, Because you look at Switch 1, the Switch Lite came out September of 2019, the Switch 1 came out March of 2017, so basically we had to wait about 2.5 years into the generation before we saw this revision of a more portable, cheaper Switch 2, and so if we were to see a Switch 2 Lite come out this year, that would be significantly sooner. However, if we look at history, it would not be unprecedented. The Nintendo DS came out late 2004, but the Nintendo DS Lite came out March of 2006, basically a year and a half later. So if we were to see a Switch 2 Lite come out September or October of this year, about a year and a few months after the console has come out, that would be pretty comparable to the amount of time we waited between the original launch of the DS and the DS Lite. And I was actually thinking this idea might be fairly likely because at the time, myself and many others were thinking that the next generation of Pokemon would be launching this year. Getting out a cheaper, lighter, more portable version of the Switch 2 ahead of the next generation of Pokemon would make so much sense. That's actually when the Switch 1 Lite came out, a couple months before the release for Pokemon Sword and Shield, the first new generation on Switch 1. And I actually still think this is a likelihood that we're going to see the Switch 2 Lite before the next generation of Pokemon. The thing that's changed though is that we now know that Pokemon Winds and Waves is not coming out until sometime in 2027. I actually assume that we're not going to have to wait that late into 2027 because we've already seen a pretty significant trailer, and this trailer shows off the starters, a lot of the gameplay. Like, it seems pretty far along. I would argue it looks more far along than the typical initial reveals we see for Pokemon generations, and usually they reveal the Pokemon games and come out with Pokemon games within the same year. So if I had to place my bet, I would say that Pokemon Winds and Waves is coming out in the first half of 2027, perhaps as the closer to the fiscal year, March 2027. So we could be only a year away from Winds and Waves right now. Which might also mean Nintendo, by that point, will want to get a Switch 2 Lite out there. I don't know if they would have released it this year because there's not as much of a need if they don't have Pokemon out there, but I could see them coming out with it in early 2027. Right before the end of the fiscal year, Pokemon and new hardware will be a really great way to close out the fiscal year. It's pretty common for Nintendo and other companies to close out their financial years strong. Look at what happened this year. We got Pokopia in March. I think there's a reason behind that. Pokopia has been a real hit and has proven to be a little bit of a system seller, so that's going to improve their overall financials as the year closes, their fiscal year. So with this latest information, I am left to think that maybe this model code OSM is for this slightly revised Switch 2 that allows the replaceable batteries, and as suggested by Nikkei, this may extend to other markets in the not-so-distant future if consumer awareness increases regarding the right to repair. And I think once people see the benefits of changing around the batteries, maybe putting in better batteries so you can have a longer battery life on the Switch 2, which a lot of people would really want, there's probably going to be more of a demand for this, so I can definitely see that happening. Now, to be clear, we don't know what model code OSM is. It might be this, it might be a Switch 2 Lite, it might be something else. It's an interesting possibility there, but I still think a Switch 2 Lite makes a lot of sense, but we'll just be getting it a little bit later. And as for a Switch 2 Pro, I just don't think that's necessary, not for a long time, if ever. Now, what I expect some people to say though is we need an OLED version for the Switch 2. Personally, I think the screen is great as is. I know there are going to be some people that are going to complain about certain elements of the Switch 2 screen, and perhaps Nintendo will improve on that at some point during the generation. But what kind of improvements could they make that would be significant enough to warrant a whole other revision? I feel like if we were to see them add an OLED screen that has other improvements as well, addressing a lot of the criticisms people have about the current Switch 2 screen, whatever that would be, it wouldn't be so noticeable and impactful to the overall general consumer that it alone would warrant a Switch 2 Plus or Switch 2 Pro or whatever sort of name they add to this. There would have to be more. Maybe if it was also more powerful, that would make it seem more beneficial. But as I said earlier, envisioning that is a bit difficult because I still feel like we have a lot of untapped potential with the current Switch 2. Perhaps what makes the most sense is that at some point or another, when the cost of parts goes down, where it would be beneficial, Nintendo would then choose to replace the screen, and this new screen might remedy some of the issues or some of the criticisms some have about the current screen on the Switch 2. But getting out a cheaper Switch 2 Lite before Pokemon comes out next year to reach a larger audience. That makes a lot of sense, especially considering this overall economic climate and how not as many people can afford more expensive consoles. And then also getting out a more quiet revision where you can replace the battery that's very consumer friendly. That might be something we see this year first. But what do you all think? What do you make of what's going on with the future of Switch 2 revisions? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.